молодости.
Your Worships, the Lord Mayor of Bradford, Lady Marys of Bradford, Honourable Members of Parliament, Reverend Fathers and Ministers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to greet you to our 17th consecutive anniversary of Captive Nations Week. 17th year following year. It speaks of commitment and dedication. I feel that today I have to talk of dedication in another sense. I feel dedication is a choice of words that can be used to describe a reliable, unchanging, and ever-present application of a human being to his work and duty. In social encounters, persons with these qualities radiate assurance, trust, and purpose. However, when a person serves in this way for something not yet attained, for an ideal or an inspired dream, dedication, in my opinion, is the only word that correctly describes it. Dear friends, such a man was Yaroslav Stechko, a great Ukrainian leader, their prime minister in 1941, who in his life's work for Ukrainian freedom has organized most of the other captive nations enslaved by communists in the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, of which he was the president. He has radiated the same influence in the work of European Freedom Council and the World Anti-Communist League. Yaroslav Stechko died in Munich on Saturday, 5th of July this year, and his funeral took place on 12th of July. I will ask you to join in a short silence in memory of this great patriot and humanitarian and freedom fighter. Thank you. Our work here in Bradford, of which we are justifiably proud, also bears witness to Yaroslav Stechko's wide influence and application to his work. He was with us and officiated at the committee's 15th and 20th anniversaries. He has been with the Ukrainian community in Bradford on many other important occasions. But more important, his example has been inspiration to us to tell the world of the danger of Russian communism and to work towards the day when the enslaved countries in Eastern Europe can be free again. When that day comes, and it will happen, we will have accomplished something that he worked for more than half a century. Thank you. It is now my great pleasure to ask the President of European Freedom Council, Member of Parliament, Honourable John Wilkinson, to address this meeting.
My Lord Mayor, Lady Marys, Geoffrey Lawler, Reverend Fathers, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor and a sad one for me to have to come and to give this keynote address during the period of mourning for Yaroslav Stechko. In everybody's life there is a period, and maybe there are one or two people that are especially formative and crucial. For me, in political and personal terms, it was my time in Bradford, when, like Geoff Lawler, I had the honour of serving as a Member of Parliament in this fine city. And in Bradford, of all the experiences that have counted for me, the experience of commemoration, the experience of dedication to the ideal of freedom, for nations and for individuals, which this Captive Nations Week represents, were very special and something that has counted over the years. And secondly, of the people that I've had the honor to work with, very few have ever matched the quality of the late Jaroslav Stetsko. He was an exceptional man in every way. Exceptional in his personal humility, exceptional in his personal dedication to the causes he believed in, exceptional in his total commitment to the nation of Ukraine and its eventual freedom, exceptional in his ability to speak out bravely for truth, exceptional in his total courage after, of course, the brutal murder of Bandera. Stetsko continued without any outward display of fear to maintain the campaign for the liberation, not just of Ukraine, but of course of the other captive nations within the Soviet bloc, the enslaved nations whose liberty we all so acutely desire. But he was rather more than that. He was a man inspired by religious faith, someone who believed that Christianity offered an ability to sustain and endure, an ability to persevere. For him, that perseverance was not crowned with eventual triumph, but it was crowned with a triumphant belief that eventually truth would prevail over falsehood, that evil would not prevail over the lie, that the Soviet system was inherently flawed, and that it had within itself the eventual seeds of its own disintegration and decay. And he was, I think, a shining example to all of us to maintain the campaign, maintain the struggle, and his work goes on. And his work, I am sure, will succeed. And I'm always deeply conscious of the fact that in his work he was not only sustained by the likes of yourselves, by the likes of Michael Sharuk and of course Gunnar Tamsons, your president, your chairman who has just spoken, but in his own wife, Slava Stetsko, he had, and I've had the privilege of working with her too, a truly exceptional human being of great determination, good humor, courage, vivacity, and administrative and organizational ability. So we mourn the passing of a great leader. We mourn the passing of someone who offered hope to the Ukrainian people and whose life was dedicated to a cause which I believe will eventually succeed. Now, if we look at the significance of the dedication of Jaroslav Stetsko's life, I think the significance essentially is this. In the post-war period, we have in the West perhaps become too secular. But if you look at the Soviet system in the East, there you see secularism carried to its extreme. And you see in the case of Father Popiełuszko in Poland, and the many martyrs of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, for example, and the Lithuanian Catholic Church, the other churches behind the Iron Curtain, how people have to die, if necessary, for their beliefs, and are still prepared to do so. And in spite of all the persecution, in spite of all the repression, in spite of a galaxy of gulags, still faith triumphs over evil, and truth prevails over the lie. So that is one element that was very fundamental to his personal philosophy, and should be, in my judgment, fundamental to our work in supporting Captive Nations Week, and of course our work in the European Freedom Council and the ABN. And then his belief in nationalism. Now, nationalism is something that is all too readily decried in the West, but I don't believe that it should be. And here again, in the celebration of Captive Nations Week, we see the very best of nationalism. We see people proud in their inheritance, people who treasure the legacy of generations, people for whom a cultural inheritance is something precious and to be sustained. It is, I think, an inheritance, it is a legacy which tends to enliven and to illumine a rather drab and dreary contemporary world. So when at this time we particularly campaign for freedom not only for individuals but for nations, it is, I think, a cause that is well worth campaigning for and well worth espousing. So we mourn the passing of a truly great individual, a fine patriot, an impressive speaker, an articulate campaigner, a persuasive writer, someone who was prepared to travel all around the globe, because the threat of communism is a global threat. And Yaroslav was prepared to travel, and regularly did, to Canada, to the United States, to Korea, throughout Europe, Taiwan, and so many other countries besides, to make sure that we in the Western world did not lose our enthusiasm for freedom, to make sure that we did not become forgetful of the essential need to restore liberty to the subjugated nations behind the Iron Curtain. We're very privileged in the West. We have a great tradition of political freedom, freedom of expression, freedom too of religious belief, freedom of association, all the things that are meant to be preserved within the Soviet bloc by the signature on the part of the Soviet Union of the Helsinki Final Act in 1975. But you know that the truth is very different behind the Iron Curtain. There is no freedom of belief. There is no freedom of movement of peoples. There is no freedom to express ideas. There is no freedom to disseminate literature. There is no freedom to broadcast, and so on. So it is particularly important that we in the West, who enjoy these things, should not lose our sense of privilege, should not lose our sense of value in having these as a common inheritance. And of course, we should not lose our sense of commitment, that those things that we enjoy and perhaps take too readily for granted are goals that are perfectly reasonable and right for the subject nations behind the Iron Curtain to have as well. Now, we do live in a difficult, dangerous time. It's particularly difficult, I think, because First Secretary Gorbachev. The Soviet bloc has at its helm a leader who is personable, who is plausible, who appears to be trustworthy, who undoubtedly has an image that is more modern than that of the rather geriatric Soviet leadership that went before. And of course, in the battle for the hearts and minds that goes on all the time, a leader such as Gorbachev in the Soviet Union is a much more formidable adversary than Chernenko or Brezhnev. Therefore, we have an even greater duty, ladies and gentlemen, to explain all the more clearly than before what the truth is of life behind the Iron Curtain. Many of you know from deep personal experience, an experience that you will pass on to subsequent generations and to your friends and those whom you meet. But many will not have any such experience at all, and they will take the propaganda and the speeches and all the persuasive talk of the Soviet leadership at face value. They'll take it at face value because wishful thinking is to a large extent the guiding principle of the gullible masses that are our democracies and are our electorates. They're gullible for no fault of their own. They're gullible because they know nothing better. Our schools perhaps don't teach the full truth of the horrors of life behind the Iron Curtain, and they have no understanding of the reality of power. So often the peace movement, for example, CND people and the others come to me and say, well, why shouldn't the United Kingdom become neutral? And I point out that neutral countries that have adjoined the Soviet Union have in history suffered terribly. For example, the Baltic states that were attacked at the beginning of World War II by the Soviets and incorporated by force of arms. For example, Finland, that was attacked at the same time, and a third of which was incorporated by the Soviet Union. And then I remind them of the attack against Poland, the incorporation of part of Poland, a very substantial portion of Poland, part of Romania, and Czechoslovakia, part of Czechoslovakia within the Soviet Union, the conclusion of World War II. And then I remind them yet again of what happened in even more recent times to another neutral alongside the Soviet Union, Afghanistan, and what became of that country, and what became of its people. And still they don't fully comprehend the necessity for us in the West to maintain an effective collective security system, because we in this country can never stand alone and hope to defend our freedom and our liberty and our independence and our national sovereignty. It is the fact that an attack against one of the NATO members is construed by all the others as an attack against them all that the Soviets are deterred from further aggression. So I seek to explain that collective security is essential, that it's no good just being neutral, and that we must have a capacity to deter future aggression. And then they say, well, what about President Reagan and his Star Wars? Isn't that an aggressive policy? Isn't that offensive? Doesn't that threaten the peace of the world? And I say, how can it be threatening or aggressive to develop new weapons which are purely defensive, which could only be used in the event of attack? How is that threatening? And then I say, did you complain when the threat against you was manned bombers? Why, when the threat is so much greater and more fearsome, namely the threat of ballistic missiles, should you wish to keep our people in this country totally vulnerable? Why should you wish to prevent them from ever having any hope of defense other than the threat of mutual retaliation. And then, of course, they say that strategic defense, the SDI, will uncouple Europe from America. Again, what nonsense. If our American friends feel more secure because their homeland is better protected against a Soviet ballistic missile attack, they will be more ready to use their nuclear weapons if we in Europe ever were attacked. And therefore, if they are more ready to use those nuclear weapons, because their people will be less fearful of the consequences against themselves, if they're more ready to, then of course deterrence is increased and the Soviets are less likely ever to attack. As so often, ladies and gentlemen, it is a case of disinformation. And I think it is the era of disinformation. Again and again, for example, we hear in the press, and above all we see in the television, of the evils of apartheid. And of course, the apartheid system in South Africa is an evil system. It goes against all the essential tenets of human rights. Human beings are equal under God, and they deserve the same political rights. And we wish that to be the case in South Africa. But if one looks at what is going on in South Africa, and you compare that against, for example, what the Marxist totalitarian government is doing in Ethiopia, the evils in South Africa, I think, look almost small by comparison, because the Soviet-supported and Cuban-supported Marxist government in Ethiopia is using famine deliberately as a weapon of war against its own people. People are being transported from Eritrea and Tigray forcibly by air to other parts of the country away from their homes. And of course the people are being corralled under a sort of collectivization system into artificial villages. Many are fleeing as refugees, and countless thousands are dying as a consequence. And of course the Ukrainian people know more than almost any other the evils of collectivization and what suffering ensued because in the Great Famine in Ukraine so many died. So to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, we commemorate Captive Nations Week at a sad time, a time of rededication of all the events associated with Yaroslav Stetsko's life. One event stands out to me. It was the occasion, again I think it was at the conclusion of Captive Nations Week, when Yaroslav and Slava Stetsko came to Bradford for the unveiling of a plaque in the cathedral. And that act and the flying of the flags before the town hall represent to me the symbolism of this city of Bradford, which has proved, as Jeff Lawler, your eloquent MP, so frequently says in speeches in the Commons and elsewhere, has proved a refuge for those who, for political reasons, have had to flee their homes and establish a new home, and of course a place where people have come to make a new life for themselves and to work hard to secure a better future for their children. It is a great, fine city with fine traditions, and that visit by the late Yaroslav Stetsko, the former Prime Minister of Ukraine, showed the commitment that this city has to freedom. It showed also that Yaroslav was dear to all of us, was someone very special in our hearts. And of course the flying of the flags of the nations which we hope will eventually be free before the town hall is something that helps us all constantly to remind our friends that these are the flags of proud nations that deserve to be free again, and that the securing of their liberty, once more, through a process of self-determination, is a cause which we all can worthily rededicate ourselves to achieving. Thank you very much.
I am sure we are all indebted to Honourable John Wilkinson for an excellent address. Thank you very much, John. The committee has prepared a resolution which I will now read. At the end of last April, the whole world was concerned about the devastation and the possible consequences from the fallout of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Western help and technical advice was given, and it was hoped that the disaster might bring the East and West together in an endeavor to eliminate the danger from nuclear accidents of whatever form for the future. To the West, that incident is yesterday's news. But from behind the Iron Curtain, we receive information of volunteers being drafted in from elsewhere in Ukraine, Lithuania and Latvia, to clean up the fallout-affected areas without full protection from radiation. Of evacuated families being split up, husbands separated from wives and children taken away from their parents. We also hear of other areas in the Soviet Empire where political prisoners are made to work exposed to various levels of radiation. Some parts of Soviet Union are devoid of population because of nuclear pollution. Yet, this monstrous and inhumane regime hides behind the Helsinki Accord and the Human Rights Declaration. We urge that the Helsinki Accord Conference on Human Rights, which takes place in Vienna, Austria next November, removes from the Soviet participants the cloak of human rights champions and declares them for what they are, demanding that they change course immediately and bring their application of human rights in line with that of other countries. We demand that family unification as major issue of the human rights section of the Helsinki Accord be observed forthwith, and all the known applications to leave Soviet Union for this reason be settled without delay. We further demand that all those who have voiced dissent about Soviet nuclear installations in Belarus, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine and elsewhere, and are in prison because of their dissent, be set free immediately. May I ask you for a show of hands if in agreement? Thank you. Anybody against? I declare the resolution carried unanimously. Right. I have now the pleasure to ask my committee colleague, Mrs. Danka Pilak, to take us through the concert part. She will be the compare. Do you want to begin?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Our first act for this evening is the Latvian Male Voice Choir, who will perform for us 3 traditional folk songs. The composer is Mr. Bruno Scolte and the conductor Mr. Alfred Talberg. Thank you. And now we have the Ukrainian Youth Association dancers, Kralachi Senior Girls, who will perform a harvest dance. The leaders and choreographers are Mr. Michael Yaku and Mrs. Oyhas Stepovna Bowes. Thank you.
że to nie połowa, jak laka znajome te koleciony browa. Hej, same jary znalezione, jak ty mają, ciemne same zakładają. Hej, same jary znalezione, jak ty mają, ciemne same zakładają.
Our next act is the Estonian musical duet, who will play a selection of folk tunes. The leader is Aina Ligama on violin and Teo Kayando on piano. Thank you. The Ukrainian Youth Association dancers Kralachi Senior Boys will now perform a dance called Arkan, which originates from Western Ukraine. Leaders and choreographers, Mr. Michael Dyakiw and Mrs. Olya Stepovana Bowles. Thank you.